Jonny, let's get you on here. Hello, sir.
How you doing, buddy?
Man, how are you?
I'm good, buddy. I'm good. Yeah.
Good.
Yeah, not too bad at all. How are you?
Yeah, we've got a few different accents on here today. We've had Olivia from, I think it was Croatia, Misty from America, and now we have the Northerner turn up.
We're coming up to absolutely take over this place as we do.
Thank you for joining us today. What I'll get to do to start with is I get you to introduce yourself, and then once the introductions done, I will try to figure out. My phone is recording this because StreamYard won't let me record it, so my phone's doing it. So I can't put a timer on, and as you might have just seen, Olivia has come back on because I cut her short by 5 minutes. So I'll try and figure out the maths as well. But Jonny, introduce yourself. Tell us a bit more about you. You've got probably quite a large introduction. So give us your full introduction, and then we'll talk about your stories and some of the advice you would give.
Sure, yeah. To introduce myself, my name's Jonny Ward. I live in Manchester, up in the north. Full time, I am a watch conductor with Manchester Fire and Rescue Service. So that's my kind of day job. I'm the guy with the white hat on the fire engine. But aside from that, part time from that, and very much more my passion, if you like, is I work within mental health. So I am a fully paid up psychotherapist. I used to work in some challenging, should we say, placements in Manchester, in Manchester with young people. Subcontract now for Anxiety UK, and I run a private practice. And then I kind of combine them both, if you like, under the helmet of the Anxious Fireman, which is my stage name, I suppose, where I combine, my lived experience, my working in the 999 services, but also being a psychotherapist to offer sort of mental health awareness training, psychological resilience training, creating psychologically safe environment training, all these sorts of different things that I feel I can offer. So I'm kind of a three hat man, really. But yeah.
I did say the introduction would be quite long. I know we've chatted beforehand, and what from more conversations, what I think you're doing is fantastic, or what you are doing.
Cheers, buddy.
What you are doing is awesome, and there is obviously a few people like you, but we need more people like you doing what you're doing. I can do the time. Let's say we started at 53. You got 18 minutes. Let's start with your story. Can you give me probably not your story, your stories, and a bit about what you maybe have been through some of your stories? You go through that, and I'll ask some questions afterwards.
Yeah, sure. It's an interesting concept, isn't it? What have I been through? And even that within itself is an interesting question, isn't it? And I suppose if I go down the sort of obvious route, and that's sort of struggling with anxiety, and that's hence the Anxious Fireman, where that's sort of all come from. If I put that in a sort of very, very basic nutshell, so about 10, 11 years ago, 12 years ago, I started struggling with panic attacks. I was young, healthy, fit, young fireman in Manchester. Where they came from is a sort of long history of being quite unconfident in myself, not being particularly self-assured, low self-esteem, all these sorts of things. And, I can always talk about where that sits later on, but ultimately where it came from is a sort of a scared inner child being in a kind of a big man's body with an ego, if you like. What happened was that ego kind of broke, and I started having these panic attacks for a variety of reasons. A bit of stress, in essence. I started sort of struggle with a bit of stress, but that sort of really started to crack into that ego I'd built up about myself. Started having these panic attacks, and I did what most men do, which is absolutely shit myself, but not really do anything about it, and certainly not tell anybody. And I kept having them. They went on and on and on. I'd hide from them. I'd put in absolutely tons of emotional energy, sort of covering them up and all these sorts of things. Went to A&E about 30 times, thinking I was unwell and having heart attacks and all these sorts of things. To the point where eventually a nice GP rolled over and said, "Jonny, this is anxiety, mate. There's nothing physically wrong with you." And where that led me to, and it's an interesting discussion point within itself, is how we label mental health and how that kind of sits with people. Because for me at the time, it was really damaging. I now had this label of having panic disorder. So I was having recurrent panic attacks, which we can label medically as panic disorder. What that did for me was make me realize, I'm having panic attacks and they might keep happening. So by default, what I started doing was fearing having the panic attacks. So anxious of being anxious. And that sort of cracked into my ego of myself again. I'm a, big shaved haired fireman who should be able to manage life and cope with life. Well, that's not really who I am. That's an image. That's an ego. That's an idea. My internal was still a very sort of afraid, very unconfident little boy. And it was that little boy inside me that was feeling the panic. So yeah, I started being afraid of having these panic attacks, especially in places where I felt unsafe, which is in essence what agoraphobia means. But again, it's a label. So at work, social situations, the pub, the gym, wherever I really was. The only time I felt semi-okay was when I was by myself. Any kind of social interaction, and that would sort of kick in this fear of panic. So I became sort of much more insular. I started sort of hiding away a lot, keeping myself to myself a lot when I used to be quite social. And sort of started to drink more, and drink a lot more, and even started drinking eventually at work when it got really bad. So I would sort of take a bottle of whiskey in with me. I've still got the last bottle I finished halfway through before I stopped. Kept in my cupboard for reminders' sake. And that just sort of led me down this road of getting worse and worse and worse, and sicker and sicker and sicker, and iller, and eventually to sort of like a depression, or the depressing of emotion, if you like, to the point where I got really, really poorly. And the best way I can describe it felt like for those of you who are old enough to remember MS-DOS, it felt like my brain went onto MS-DOS, or for those who have a car, it felt like my brain went into limp home mode. I just couldn't function properly. I was sort of panicky, and that was about the only emotion I could feel apart from very, very low or depressed, if we like. And yeah, that sort of spiraled on and on, and it was very unwell for a while. Eventually, someone at work caught me drinking, and that led me to, in essence, having to change and challenge what was going on for me. And that brought about me talking about these things. One of the ways I did that was I started a Twitter account called The Anxious Fireman, and it just all kind of went from there, really. And now I'm sat here. So I hope that makes sense. Sense to you?
Yeah, it makes. I think as you said, the labels can be unhelpful. But yeah, I think your story makes sense, and where you are now to where you have been, it's obviously been a journey. And within that, I know there's been obviously lots of stuff going on. But let's move this on to some of the suicide kind of bits and the relevant parts of this conversation. So I don't know where you would like to start first. I know you've lost a couple of colleagues to suicide, but I've also known you've been there, being the person holding somebody from committing or stopping them from committing suicide and getting them off of bridges, off of different areas. So where would you like to start first?
Well, I suppose my friends kind of feed into the story. I suppose they happened whilst I was starting to struggle myself, and they certainly played into that, with the trauma of that and the kind of loss and grief that goes along with that. Both of them were, in a way, different stories, I suppose. And one, it's the kind of classic, we didn't know any signs. No one knew he was struggling. He just didn't turn up for work one day. So the fire engine went to get him from his house, assuming he'd slept in. And unfortunately, he hadn't slept in. He'd completed suicide. I guess there's two things. One is that signs and symptoms, I think, for me anyway, and I don't want to knock anyone else's opinion, but for me, they may be a little dated. I think people who are really struggling with things like suicide ideation, they may offer kind of invitations to help them. But one thing they will certainly do is hide those signs from people that they either care about, or that they don't want to show them to, or they may feel judged by, or that they don't want to upset. And that's why in my experience, especially now being a therapist, people might say, well, I didn't notice any signs. They didn't offer any, we didn't know that they were struggling. Well, you might not, because they've not offered you that invitation to ask those questions. They've covered themselves with a mask to hide that pain from you, or whatever that may be. So whenever I get people who say, we didn't know any signs and symptoms, I sort of offer that back to them with, well, no, you won't, because they probably cared about you and didn't want you to feel what they were feeling. They may offer invitations to help them if they feel able to, which my first friend didn't. He was completely silent, and we had in essence no idea until the act happened. My other friend who took his life, that was following an incident in Manchester, a fire where a firefighter died on Oldham Street in Manchester. If anyone wants to Google that, Paul's Hair World. Probably just done them a really bad turn of, of advertising, haven't I? But one of our guys passed away in a fire, and my other friend Lee died about 2 years later from PTSD and suicide, completing suicide because of that. Now, he did offer many signs, many invitations to help him. Where we messed up, quite frankly, is didn't pick up any of those invitations, whether that be through not knowing what to do, not knowing how to do it, feeling difficult conversations, not knowing what to say. And then also, quite frankly and quite bluntly, male ego. You know, we let him down, frankly. We judged him more than anything. We did the classics. Well, what will your family think? Well, that's just going to make him feel a whole lot better, isn't it?
Yeah.
You know, why do you feel like this? Well, just go for a jog. You know, all these sorts of things that was meant out from a good place, but actually were quite naive. And he did offer many invitations to help him with his suicidal ideation, even to the point of telling us that he tried it several times. And we didn't, as a service and as a crew and as friends, particularly take that on board. And it is something I will regret for the rest of my life and live with quite heavily. But it did lead me into wanting to learn more about mental health, you know, after losing Lee, and that's, I guess, one of the big drivers behind why I do these things now, in his memory, I suppose.
Yeah, that must be hard. So thank you for obviously talking about that. And I think your story, that story there, is when a friend is maybe showing signs, and there are two different sides of this coin, right? There is the side where people hide, and I think that's from the person I lost in 2018. I wasn't in that environment as much. The guys that were around him said there was no signs. You couldn't tell. Sure. And then looking back, very similar to Missy, so then looking back, there was maybe a few signs. Where I think you're correct on that. They do hide it, and they choose to hide it from the correct people. And I think if you're on for John, the next person talking, you'll hear how actually maybe they're not even there, and they're just kind of floating around and maybe not present. The second part, and I think as you just talking about, I think that is a big part of it. It's maybe male ego. It is maybe not understanding how to support, or maybe not taking it seriously because you don't understand it. And I think this is where these awareness days, mental health awareness week, suicide awareness month, suicide awareness day, mental health world, mental health, these days are so important because it helps educate people, understand. And I don't know when you lost your friend Lee, I think the awareness is getting better. It's still miles off where it needs to be, but I'm hoping what we're doing here helps.
Yeah, I agree. I think every little helps, you know, in the classic phrase. I think the very fact that we're even running this is an improvement, isn't it? Because I know Lee died in 2015, but before that, you know, and I know growing up, you know, I mean, I'm 37, so I'm not old, but, you know, growing up, there was nothing. No one discussed their mental health. I know my parents' generation certainly didn't. I know when I was younger, we didn't. Even in my early 20s to early 30s, it was still unheard of. So I think it's taken a big uphill kind of speed recently, which is great, which is really good, you know, and it should, you know, the fact that for me, the place to be at would be where we don't need mental health awareness days. It's just part of our life. It's part of our existence. It's part of what it is to be a human being. You know, anxiety, depression, that they're normal emotions, but that can be triggered for, you know, for events that may be disordered, or they can be disordered within your system, but within themselves, they're not wrong. You know, your emotions are telling you things, and we often ignore them or don't listen to them. And, you know, the beautiful place to be would be in a situation where we don't have to do suicide awareness days or mental health awareness weeks or whatever it is. We just accept and acknowledge that as human beings, we have complex emotions and we can get poorly. You know, I think that would be the sweet spot, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I think that wouldn't that be a great world, right? We can all do it. I suppose this is where I think when we build that awareness and when we break that judgmental area of it, it makes a difference. So I'll give you a bit of background of my bringing up. My dad was very honest and communicated very clearly some of the thoughts he had through the recession in 1990 when I was born, and then through the second recession when you lose everything. And he talks about his sense of pride, and he had suicidal thoughts, but they were flashing, so they would pass very quickly. But he would communicate that. He told us that. He was very open with it, and I think that makes a huge difference to breaking that barrier of what Missy was talking about earlier on, of feeling weak, because it's done as you're growing up. My dad didn't live with me. My mum left my mum early doors, but just by having parents and people around you which are open about emotions makes a huge difference. So I think the more we can do this awareness piece, and people can become more comfortable about saying, actually, I'm not feeling great. This is what's going on in my head. This is what emotions feel like. It makes it easier for us to discuss it as a family, as a friendship group, as a group of colleagues in work and everything else.
I totally agree. And, I always say expression is the opposite of depression, not happiness. Happiness is an emotion we can feel, and it's great, but it's not the opposite of sadness and depression. Expression is, when we depress emotions and pin them in and hold on to them, then they never become expressed and therefore validated. And that's how we process emotions. But often that's not done. It's not done, and it's not healthy. It's healthy to feel what sounds like what your dad did. And obviously, I don't know that situation, but it sounds like what he did was exactly what he needed to do. This is what I'm experiencing. I'm expressing it, so you can validate my experience of it. And that's how we process, and that's healthy.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that's why I wanted to do this. We begin to understand what we're doing. We begin to understand what people's thoughts are behind what they do and they choose to do. So I think we've gone way off questions. But yeah, let me just check in here. So yeah, you've answered one of them. Was there any signs from both colleagues? You said yes. You said you've been at a couple of suicides. How have you gone about retrieving them safely to get them off that brink of jumping or wherever that was? I know I don't want to go too much details, but question I'm trying to ask. Sorry. Sure,
it's a difficult question to ask, isn't it? Yeah, and you say some. I'd caveat that with many. I've just finished four shifts, so 4 12-hour shifts in essence, and we've had 4 people on bridges just this last week, just from one engine at one station. So it's becoming a very common occurrence, which is really sad. Where my station is based on the M60 motorway, so there's many bridges near where we are. It's complex and it's scary and it's difficult. If I go through it pragmatically, we have to do things that keep people safe. So we might, for example, block the bridges off, put practical things in place, shut the motorways, which is why people see them closed, and then put things like rope systems in place so we can get to people safely. And if they do fall and we're near them, we won't fall with them. Or if we do grab them and they jump or fall, then we won't fall with them, or we can hopefully grab them too. What we say to them is the challenging bit, and it is often not as structured as you would hope. I think the first thing is to try and make a dialogue and make a connection with them, because obviously we're just a random person in a uniform where a real power imbalance can happen. So, getting down to their level, if that means physically kneeling down on the other side of the barrier, talking to them, introducing yourself as a person, not as a sort of person in a uniform, but just as, I am Jonny. Can I have your name? What's going on? Letting them sort of, if they can, walk through that, as best they can, what's going on, why they're there. In my experience, people are often very reluctant to open up when they're at that point. It's always been that they are more in this kind of flux between, am I going to complete this or not? And it's really scary because they may just be ignoring you, and they may edge towards the edge and then move back when they decide not to, or they may have cuts, for example, where they've self-harmed and that's bleeding, we can't get to it, or they may take pills while on the edge, and you worry that is that going to make them drowsy or give them the sort of, I say confidence, I don't mean confidence, but the sort of take away the fear of the fall to do it. And it can just be really scary. We spent 10 minutes begging people not to jump, I've done suicide first aid and all that, and I know there's sort of ways of managing it, but sometimes it is just a case of begging, please don't jump, please don't fall, please do not jump. We're here for you. Whatever we can do, we'll do it. We're here to help you and get you back. It's an on the edge situation. We had one a couple of weeks ago where someone was attempting to jump, and as me and my colleague lifted ourselves over the barrier, he went to jump, so we grabbed his wrists and we just caught him and managed to hold him and lift him back up over the bridge after about 10 minutes of them struggling. And that was a really scary situation to be in, and I'd never want to be in it again, quite frankly, because we nearly fell too. And I'm not giving you that as some sort of great story, because I'm not. I'm just a guy. It's a really scary situation to be in, and they are frightening and emotionally draining, and
they sound tough. They sound tough. Just listening to you talk about that, for me, sounds tough. And it brings up a lot, doesn't it? I think I don't know what to say. My brain is processing it still, and I think it processed it last time we spoke about this, didn't it? It is hard. What you guys do for that is just immense, and I think everybody in your field, which have to go through that and support people within that, should get a medal.
I appreciate that. I do. I want to caveat that we are, as the fire service, the small side of that. When you add in the skill and the caring and the empathy of social care, mental health services, the NHS, we play an insignificant role compared to the bravery that they put in, and I would never take that ever away from them. But yeah, it does. Even saying it, I can feel myself welling up a bit because it's hard, but it's also unfortunately part of our role. So.
Yeah. I'm going to ask you one last question, Jonny. Sorry. What's your advice for people in the situation of suicidal ideation, or people around suicide?
Express how you're feeling, whether it be wherever it is. Express how you're feeling, process it, work it through, accept it. We can, yes, access help, yes, access support, absolutely. I think the biggest thing for me is listen to what your body's telling you and try and follow what it's telling you, and be kind to yourself. We can talk about external judgment all day, and that's one of my big things that I like to get across when I do my courses, this sort of external judgment that we can apply to each other, but there's nothing more powerful than our own judgment to ourselves. And I think if anyone is feeling that, struggling with suicidal ideation, struggling with those thoughts, I think the first place is to be kind to yourself. We are human beings, and it is unfortunately something that haunts our species, suicide. The other part of it is try and articulate what it is you feel to either someone else or professionals, wherever that may be, so that you can hopefully process what it is that's going on for you, and hopefully take away some of that overwhelm that can lead to people completing suicide. And stay safe. If you feel unsafe, try and be somewhere that's safe, whether it be around people or come to the fire station. I'll give you a brew.
No. Thank you, Jonny. That is some stories, some great advice. We've run over, but I didn't want to cut you short on giving those kind of fantastic tips. But thank you. We will obviously chat again after. But for now, thank you so much. I hope somebody has taken some of those bits of advice to heart.
Yeah, no, and thank you, Richard. What you're doing is amazing. I have nothing but the highest respect for you. You take care of yourself, buddy, and everyone else.
Yeah.